I've been in this room now for quite a fair amount of time, so I especially thank those who are enjoying the 202 environment. I think the geeky conference was really wonderful, and everyone has been thanked. I want to thank everyone again and again and again. And I want to thank Four Directions for their sponsorship of Glen's talk tonight, and SNID, Studies in National and International Development, and the Initiative for Land-Based Studies at Queen's, another sponsor of tonight's event. And that's all I'm going to say, except to pass over to Betty Carbright, who's going to do welcome for us. Thank you.
Hello, it's me again. I did the opening and closing earlier, so I'm going to open this again. I just wanted to offer the words before all else. That's something our people have always done for any event that we have. And so I'm going to do a quick version and open this up, and then at the end of the session, if I'm not here, to take your minds apart so that you can go off on your journey. So, Sego Chowanja Headstone Yunga, Sakwari Dano Kuyungahaga, Deyetinu Arado Ne Unwe Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Yetini Suha Ohunja, Deyetinu Arado Ne Oneka Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gunchu Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Ohunde Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Onukwa Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Odekara Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gakwa Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gahi Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Ojinua Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Garondo Suha, Dana Ogre Suha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gundirio, Deyetinu Arado Ne Ojidu Ogumha, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gayeri Nigralage, Deyetinu Arado Ne Ratueres, Donchida Wano Arado Ne Jokanaka Garakwa, Deyetinu Arado Ne Yeti Sutta Asantanaka Garakwa, Deyetinu Arado Ne Oji Stokwa Suma, Deyetinu Arado Ne Gayeri Niumbedige, Donchida Wano Arado Ne Sungwai Disum, Atami Duhak Ne Wanagura. So what I did was I offered our greetings and our thanksgiving to everything in creation that was provided for us to live a good life. Starting with the people and moving up the chain of creation, from Mother Earth to the waters and the fish life and the plants, the medicines, the berries, the green things, the trees and the bushes, the insect life, the animals, the bird life, the birds who remind us to be joyful, the four winds who bring the change of seasons, our grandfathers, the thunder beings, our elder brother, the sun, our grandmother, the moon, the stars, our cousins, the four messengers who have come to help our people through the ages, and finally to Creator who created everything for us to live a good life. So now we'll go on.
Hi everybody, I'm Scott Morganson, and I want to thank Richard for asking me to do Glen's introduction. It is a real honor to be in this role and to be in the presence of someone who, as I understand it, is understood to be one of the most formidable scholars in Indigenous Studies transnationally today. Glen Coulthard is a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, and he is an assistant professor in the First Nation Studies program and the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. And many of you will know that his writings have achieved really momentous recognition in the areas of Indigenous thought and politics, contemporary political theory, and also radical social and political thought. And notably, your work has been taken up not only across a variety of academic fields, but also specifically within social movements. It's been an inspiration to movements and a contribution to them as well. I've managed to dog here almost all of this text, and I expect the rest of it will be quite page-turned very soon. It's been, I've known Glen for a while now. It's been really instructive to me and really inspirational to me to have an opportunity to work with you as a colleague in a number of environments over the last few years and as a friend I want to thank you for all the work that I've seen you do in other places as well. Thank you for being here tonight to do your work. Your work at, well, I'll try not to embarrass you too much by not saying you. So Glen's work has been really, for me, some of the most incisive and unapologetic scholarship that has been coming out of critical Indigenous theory in this generation. And it never hesitating to challenge where challenges need to be placed. As I was reading through the book, just to give you a sense of the places that are resonating in my mind, I think that you know this, I think the way that Glen has taken up Fanon within a critical Indigenous frame is going to be unforgettable for quite a long time. There's a lot of interest in Fanon, in interdisciplinary scholarship, in post-colonial studies, anti-colonial criticism, critical race studies, Black diaspora studies. The contribution to Fanon scholarship here seems to me as a teacher to be changing the tone of discussion in some very significant ways, and I look forward to hearing if you do speak about it tonight, more about that, but also just being present for those conversations as they continue. And there's also, as someone who works in feminist studies, there's a very strong critique of both essentialism and anti-essentialism within contemporary political theory, which is demonstrating one of the ways that Indigenous scholarship is radically transforming the ways that people think in a variety of contexts that maybe people wouldn't necessarily assume that work is being taken on. And of course, there's a very strong argument here for Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, resurgence, and decolonization. And the book, as for those of you who have had a chance to read through it, demonstrates those incredibly strong resonances between Coulthard's argument and the work that we have seen being practiced and modeled by Indigenous peoples across this continent in the moment of I Don't Know More. And so with that, I also want to say that Glen was a featured, I'm sorry I'm Glenning you, but it's hard for me to say Coulthard to your face. So actually that sounds kind of cool. So Coulthard's been a featured contributor to the groundbreaking anthology, The Winter We Danced, Voices from the Past, the Future, and the I Don't Know More movement. Many, if not all of you, have encountered this fabulous book. It was published by ARP Books in March 2014 to great acclaim. His co-edited book, Recognition versus Self-Determination, Dilemmas of Emancipatory Politics, was released in spring 2014 by UBC Press. And as we who are gathered here well know, his book, Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, was released in August 2014 by the University of Minnesota Press. So would you please help me in welcoming Professor Glen Coulthard.
Thank you, Scott. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you to Richard Day for kind of getting me here. Last minute, I was in Toronto for a lunch last night, and he started scheming a week or so ago to get me here. I was happy to do so. Thank you to Four Directions also for helping sponsor the event. I apologize for not being able to attend the conference. It looked and sounded great by what Richard was telling me in the car. I'm pretty new at this book thing, so I'm not sure how to do this. I've been kind of changing it up every time that I do. Sometimes I'll emphasize on some of the theoretical work that I'm doing in it, and sometimes I'll emphasize the kind of more activist-y stuff, and I think I'm going to do the latter. And instead of just kind of rehashing the argument, I'm going to work off of some text here that comes. It's a truncated part of the book in the conclusion, where I took the liberties to kind of say, I guess, more what I feel and think about how I envision Indigenous resurgence and what we need to think through in our efforts at decolonization and self-determination. And in the book, I kind of pointedly do this through a number of theses that I have on it. So I'm just going to work through those theses. I'm going to avoid the stuff on Fanon for the most part and Marx, which are central. I just want to say one thing about the type of indigenous or theory that I do, is that even though I engage quite critically with a number of canonical figures in the radical kind of Western tradition and kind of classical anti-colonial thought, I do so coming from a kind of a normative cultural core that I have learned through my own upbringing and work that I do as a Dene individual. So even though it is engaging these theoretical traditions, it does so from an indigenous perspective. So it's a way of doing political theory that is diverse in the sources that I engage with, but it's grounded in my own community's perspectives. So I want to start with the first thesis, and this is on direct action. So I want to structure my comments on direct action around what I see as a problematic restraint that's increasingly being placed on Indigenous peoples in our efforts to transform the relationship between our societies and Canada. This constraint involves a type of tactics that are being represented as morally legitimate in our efforts to defend our land and our rights as Indigenous nations, and those that are increasingly being presented as either morally illegitimate or at least potentially self-defeating because of their disruptive, extra-legal, and therefore potentially alienating character. With respect to those approaches deemed legitimate in defending our rights, emphasis is usually placed on formal negotiations, usually carried out between official Aboriginal leadership and representatives of the state. And if need be, these negotiations are coupled with largely symbolic and ineffective acts of peaceful, non-disruptive protest that abide by Canada's rule of law. Those approaches that are increasingly deemed illegitimate, by contrast, include but are not limited to forms of direct action that seek to influence power through less mediated and sometimes more disruptive and confrontational measures. In the context of Indigenous people's struggles, these forms of direct action often take, and to be problematic, include activities like temporarily blocking access to Indigenous territories with the aim of impeding the exploitation of our lands and resources, or in rarer cases still, the more or less permanent reoccupation of portions of our community, again with the effort to impede or entirely block access to our territories by the corrosive powers of state and capital. Regardless of their diversity and specificity, however, these forms of approaches to self-determination tend to get branded in the mainstream as the typical native blockade, militant, threatening, disruptive, and violent. There are three arguments that typically get used when critics rail against these more or less assertive forms of Indigenous direct action. The first is that negotiations, we are repeatedly told ad nauseum, are objectively speaking simply more effective in securing our rights and interests as Indigenous nations. This is simply false. Historically, I would venture to suggest that negotiations over the scope and content of Aboriginal people's rights in the last 40 years have always piggybacked off the assertive direct action spearheaded by largely Indigenous women and other grassroots elements of our communities. For example, there would have been no negotiations over Aboriginal rights and title in British Columbia through the current land claims process, as shitty as it is, if it were not for the ongoing commitment of Indigenous activists willing to put their bodies on the line in defense of their lands and communities. There would have been no Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, as insufficient as its recommendations are, without the land-based direct actions of the 1980s and 90s, which saw Indigenous peoples putting themselves directly in harm's way, and armed if necessary in the defense of their lands in distinct ways of life. Likewise, there would have been no pressure to establish a national inquiry into the 1,200 plus murdered and missing Aboriginal women and girls in Vancouver and across the country if it were not for the thousands of Indigenous women and their allies who have formed lasting networks of mutual care and support and taken to the streets every year on February 14th for more than 2 decades to ensure that state-sanctioned violence against Indigenous women and girls ends here and now. All of this is to say that if there has been any progress in securing our rights to land and life, including those that are largely attributed to the male-dominated world of formal negotiations, this progress is owed to the committed activists practicing their obligations to the land and on the land with each other in these diverse networks and communities of struggle. Now, the second argument that gets used to denounce or criticize the more or less disruptive forms of Indigenous direct action involve these actions supposedly self-defeating or alienating character. The idea this time is that insofar as these tactics disrupt the lives of perhaps well-intentioned but equally ignorant non-Indigenous peoples, First Nations will increasingly find themselves alienated and our causes unsupported by the average working class Canadian. First, I think getting this reaction from the dominated society is unavoidable. Indigenous peoples have within our sights the fundamental restructuring of the relationship between ourselves and the Canadian state. For more than 2 centuries, this relationship has run roughshod over our rights as Indigenous peoples, which has resulted in a massive stockpiling of power and privilege by and for the dominant society. Land has been stolen and significant amounts of it must be returned. Power and authority have been unjustly appropriated and much of it will have to be reinstated. This will inevitably be very upsetting to some. It will be very inconvenient to others, but it's what needs to happen if we are to create a more just and sustainable life for the bulk of Indigenous communities and for the majority, I would argue, of non-Indigenous folks as well. My second point is that this criticism is racist. I suggest that equally disruptive actions undertaken by various sectors of, for example, the mainstream labor movement, including job actions ranging from the withdrawal of teaching, transit, and healthcare, to full-blown strike activity does not often undergo the same scrutiny that our struggles for sovereignty and land defense are subjected to. When these sectors of society defend their rights outside of the increasingly hostile and imposed forms of labor legislation, actions that also tend to disrupt and disproportionately disrupt working-class Canadians, it is crucial that we educate ourselves about the causes that inform these struggles. All Indigenous people ask is that the same courtesy be offered our communities and our justice efforts. Now, the third critique that involves, it's a little bit more esoteric, what we might characterize as a neo-Nietzschean concern over the largely reactive stance that such acts of resistance like blockading take in practice. On the surface, blockades in particular appear to be the epitome of reaction insofar as they clearly embody a resounding no, but fail to offer a more affirmative gesture or alternative built into the practice itself. The risk here, we're told, is that these ressentiment-laden expressions of Indigenous resistance reify the very structures and social relationships that we find so abhorrent. In Nietzsche's terms, insofar as this no becomes our, quote, creative deed, we end up dependent on the hostile world we have come to define ourselves entirely against. We become dependent on, quote, external stimuli to act at all. Our action is fundamentally one of reaction. This concern is premised on a profound misunderstanding about what these forms of action are all about. In his own creative engagement with Nietzsche at the end of Blasting My Massive Fanon explains that yes, quote, man, and I'm using his gendered language here, which is obviously problematic, is an affirmation, and we shall never stop repeating it. Yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity. So on Nietzsche's side here. But man, he continues on to crucially insist, and now he's against Nietzsche, is also a negation. No to man's contempt, no to the indignity of man, no to the exploitation of man, no to the massacre of what is most human in man, freedom. It is through explicitly disruptive oppositional practices that Indigenous peoples physically say no to the degradation of our communities and to the exploitation of our lands upon which we all depend. But these practices also have ingrained with them a profound and resounding yes. They are an affirmative enactment of another modality of being. a different way of relating to and with the world. And in the case of blockades like the one erected by the Anishinaabe at Grassy Narrows, which has been in existence since 2012, they literally become another way of life, another form of community. They embody through praxis our ancestral obligations to the lands that are core to who we are as Indigenous people. Thesis 2, capitalism no more. What the recent direct actions of First Nations communities against the proliferation of pipelines and liquefied natural gas exploration and so on, demonstrate is that Indigenous forms of economic disruption are indeed are not only a negation but an affirmation. They are a crucial act of negation insofar as they seek to impede or block the flow of resources that are currently being transported to international markets from oil and gas fields, refineries, lumber mills, mining operations, and hydroelectric facilities located on the stolen lands of Indigenous nations. These modes of direct action, in other words, seek to negatively impact the economic infrastructure that is core to colonial accumulation of capital in settler political economies like Canada. Blocking access to this critical infrastructure, however, has been quite effective, at least in the short term, for giving access and gains to Indigenous communities. Over the last couple of decades, however, the state and corporate powers have also been quite skilled at recuperating the losses that have been incurred by these direct actions by dragging Indigenous leaders off the land back to negotiations that are determined strictly and always in the interests of settler capital. What tends to get ignored by many commentators, however, is these actions again are also an affirmation. They're a gesture of Indigenous resurgence insofar as they embody an enactment of Indigenous law and the obligations that such law places on us to uphold relations of reciprocity that shape our engagement with the human and other than human world. In other words, the land. The question I want to explore, albeit briefly, is how might we move beyond a resurgent Indigenous politics that seeks to inhibit the destructive effects of capital to one that seeks to create Indigenous alternatives to it. Stated quite bluntly, without a massive transformation in the political economy of Canadian settler colonialism, any efforts to rebuild our nations will remain parasitic on capitalism and thus on the perpetual exploitation of our lands and our labor. Consider, for example, an approach to resurgence that would see Indigenous peoples begin to reconnect with our lands and land-based practices on either a small-scale individual or collective basis, but still requires us to supplement that with work that is done through wage slave labor. This could take the form of walking the land, for example, in an effort to refamiliarize ourselves with the landscapes and places that give our histories and cultures content, our languages shape and movement, to revitalizing and engaging in land-based harvesting practices like hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and or revitalization of cultural production activities like hide tanning and carving, all of which also serves to assert our sovereign presence in a micro way in a micro-political way on our territories that can be profoundly educating and empowering. Through the reoccupation of sacred places for the purposes of relearning and practicing our ceremonial languages. All of this is important regenerative work, but as long as we have to engage and are dependent on the capitalist market, they'll still remain parasitic to one significant and corrosive form of power that has destroyed our land base and our communities. A similar problem informs self-determination efforts that seek to curtail poverty and economic dependencies through resource revenue sharing, more comprehensive impact benefit agreements, and affirmative action employment strategies that are often negotiated with with the state and those forms of capital and corporations that are actually tearing up our territories. Even though the capital generated by this could be, in theory, placed back and subsidize some of our cultural resurgence activities, they are often not. And even when they are, or if they are, they would still remain dependent on a predatory economy that is entirely at odds with the deep reciprocity that forms the cultural core of who we are as Indigenous peoples. A core that I would want to suggest is non-negotiable. What forms might an Indigenous economic alternative take? For some communities, reinvigorating a mix of subsistence-based activities with more contemporary economic ventures might be one alternative. So I discussed this at length with my own community's struggle, the Dene Nation, in the 1970s, where we sought to curtail the negative environmental and cultural impact of capitalist and colonial exploitation on our lands by proposing to establish an economy that would apply the traditional concepts associated with Dene governance, so decentralized regional practices or political structures based on participatory consensus decision-making to the realm of the economy. At the time, this would have seen a revitalization of a bush mode of production, with emphasis placed on harvesting and manufacturing of local renewable resources through traditional activities like fishing and trapping, potentially combined with and partially subsidized by other economic activities that would be held communally by the Dene Nation. Economics models discussed during this time included the democratic organization of production and distribution through indigenous cooperatives and worker-controlled enterprises. And part of the Dene rationalization of this contemporary economic model was that it was more attentive to and based on our cultural traditions. There would be bosses no more. Revisiting indigenous political economic alternatives such as these would pose a real threat, I think, to the capitalist accumulation in settler colonial context in at least three ways. First, through mentorship and education, these economies would reconnect indigenous peoples to land-based practices and forms of knowledge that emphasize radical sustainability. This form of what I call in the book grounded normativity is antithetical to capitalist accumulation. Second, these economic practices offer a means of subsistence that over time can help break our dependence on the capitalist market by cultivating self-sufficiency through the localized and sustainable production of core foods and life materials that we would distribute and consume within our own communities on a regular basis. Third, through the application of indigenous governance principles to non-traditional economic activities, we open up, I think, a way of engaging contemporary or foster sustainable economic decision-making, an equitable distribution of resources within and between our communities, Native women's political and economic emancipation, and empowerment for citizens that work or are forced to work or choose to work in sectors of the economy outside of the bush. The capacity of resurgence or resurgent indigenous economies to challenge the hegemony of settler colonial capitalism in the long term can only happen, however, if certain conditions are met. This is where it gets tricky. In particular, all of the colonial, racist, patriarchal, and political obstacles that have been used to block our access to land need to be confronted and removed. Of course, capitalism continues to play a core role in the dispossession of our lands and self-determining capacities, but it only does so with the aid of other forms of exploitation and domination that are configured along racial, gender, and state lines. Dismantling all of these oppressive practices and structures won't be easy. It will require that we continue to assert our presence on all of our territories, coupled with an escalation of confrontations with these forces of colonialism through the forms of direct action that I spoke of previously. Thesis 3, whose street? Our streets. Indigenous sovereignty and the city. So in Canada, more than half of our population now live in urban centers. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the city, however, has always been one that's been incredibly fraught with tension. Historically, Canadian cities were originally conceived of in the colonial imagination as explicitly non-native spaces, as civilized spaces, and urban planners and policymakers went through great efforts to expunge our urban centers from Indigenous peoples and their peasants. In 1911, for example, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier announced in Parliament, not John A. Macdonald, which this seems to be entirely fascinated with. I can't imagine a drunk that has been so acclaimed. Anyway. Where a reserve, this is John A. Macdonald, and he says that in Parliament, he quotes, where a reserve is in the vicinity of a growing town, and this is the case, in several places it becomes a source of nuisance and an impediment to progress. This development rationale, which at the time conceived of native space in a Lockean manner, particularly reserves now as uncultivated wastelands, justified an amendment to the Indian Act a month later. This amendment stipulated that residents of, quote, any Indian reserve which adjoins or is situated beside or wholly within an incorporated town having a population of at least 8,000 people, could be legally removed from the present location without their consent if it was deemed to be, quote, in the interest of the public and of the Indians of the band for who the reserve is held. Just take the land. This situated Indian policy, I would argue, in a kind of odd position, as by the turn of the 19th century, the reserve system, originally implemented to isolate and marginalize indigenous peoples for the purposes of social engineering, i.e. assimilation and genocide, was starting to be looked at as an entire failure by the crafters of Indian policy, precisely because of their geographical distance from the civilizational influence of cities. Here you have the economic imperatives of capitalist accumulation, i.e. dispossession, rounding indigenous peoples up on reserves, come into sharp conflict with the white supremacist racist impulses of assimilation, which would demand that we integrate into cities, but the cities have always been wanted to be held for settlers and white people. As Gene Barton says, the cities for themselves and only themselves. The civilizational discourse that rationalized both the theft of indigenous peoples' land base and our subsequent confinement onto the reserves facilitated a significant geographical separation of the colonizer and the colonized that lasted at least until the mid-20th century, a world divided in two, as Phenomena said. As Shireen Razak notes, the segregation of urban from native space that marked this colonial era began to break down with the increase in urbanization that started to occur in the 1950s and 60s. And this resulted in a new racial configuration of space now within cities. So inner cities, ghettos, these sorts of things. Now the dispossession that originally displaced us from our traditional territories, either onto reserves or disproportionately into the inner cities of Canada's major urban centers, is now serving to displace indigenous populations from urban spaces we have increasingly been made to call home. To this end, I suggest that the analytical frame of settler colonization developed throughout my book offers an important lens through which to interrogate the power relations that shape indigenous people's experiences both on the land and in the cities, especially in the city case, those inhabiting low-income areas. Defenders of settler colonial power, of course, have tended to rationalize their practices as treating the lands in question as terra nullius, the white supremacist legal fiction that declared indigenous peoples too primitive to hold rights to land and sovereignty in our early encounters with European colonizers. And this, of course, rendering our territories legally vacant and open for colonial settlement and development. Now, in inner cities like Vancouver, where I work, or Edmonton, or Winnipeg and Toronto, and I would assume here, we are seeing a similar Lockean logic govern the gentrification and subsequent dispossession and displacement of indigenous peoples from these spaces within cities. Commonly defined as the transformation of working class areas of the city into middle-class residential and or commercial spaces, gentrification has also shown to be structurally prone to dispossession and displacement, specifically of poor, racialized, indigenous, and other marginalized members of our societies. In spite of these negative effects, however, gentrifiers often defend their projects as a form of improvement, through which previously wasted lives, land, and property are made more socially and economically productive. This Lockean rationale has led some scholars to view gentrification through its colonial lens, as yet another frontier of dispossession central to the accumulation of capital. To my mind, such a perspective is crucial insofar as it highlights not only the class composition of urban development and displacement, but also the manner in which colonial ideologies of race and gender converge with class in a structural process that's geared towards the acquisition of lands and resources previously under the care and authority of self-determining nations, now in cities. As urban geographers like Nicholas Blomley and Jeff Summers note, like the representational practices that originally served to render much of North America legally vacant and therefore up for grabs by greedy colonists, the new urban frontiers of places like Vancouver's downtown east side are increasingly presented as, quote, wild, dangerous, and ultimately empty spaces ripe for resettlement. Through gentrification, native spaces in the cities are now being treated as urbs nullius, urban space void of indigenous sovereign presence. Coming to grips with and addressing this structural congruency between indigenous land-based and indigenous urban struggles must be central to any form of decolonization, I argue, that is worth the name. On the necessity of gender justice and decolonization. 2 more. The violence that Indigenous women face is both systemic and symbolic. It is systemic in the sense that it has been structured into a relatively secure and resistant set of oppressive material relationships that render Indigenous women far more likely than their non-Indigenous counterparts to suffer severe economic and social privation. Just as importantly, however, the violence that Indigenous women and girls face is also symbolic in the sense that Pierre Bourdieu used the term, quote, gentle and visible violence, unrecognized as such. Symbolic violence, in other words, is the subjectifying form of violence that renders the crushing materiality of systemic violence invisible, appear natural, acceptable. The symbolic violence of settler colonial misogyny, which is a term I borrowed from my friend and colleague, Anishinaabe feminist Dori Nason, institutionalized through residential school and successive Indian acts, has become so diffuse now that it saturates and structures all of our relationships. The misogyny of settler colonial misrecognition through state legislation has functioned so completely, and this is a point that I take and have learned much from Benita Lawrence, and so subtly that it now informs many of our struggles, including those for recognition and liberation. In such context, what does it mean to be held accountable, as Nason demands, to our, quote, responsibilities to protect the values and traditions that serve as the foundation for the survival of the land and Indigenous peoples? To start, I would suggest that it demands that Indigenous peoples commit ourselves in practice to uprooting the symbolic violence that structures Indigenous women's lives as much as we throw around in words that the material violence against Indigenous women has come to an end. If we fail to address the systemic and symbolic character of Indigenous women's violence and the disproportionality of that violence, decolonization will simply remain a man-made colonial sham. And finally, decolonization beyond the nation state. So now we're in a position, I think, to revisit a concern that I think is kind of problematic, and it's made by Dale Turner in his book, This Is Not a Peace Pipe. Turner's claim is that if Indigenous peoples want the political and relationship, and this is the central argument that I make about recognition, to be informed by and reflect our distinct worldviews, then we, quote, have to engage the state's legal and political discourses in more effective ways. This form of engagement, I argue, assumes that the structure of domination that frames Indigenous relations in Canada derives its legitimacy and its reproductive capacity by excluding Indigenous peoples from the legal and political settings within which our rights are determined. Seen from this light, it would appear that critically undermining colonialism requires that Indigenous peoples find more effective ways of participating in the legal and political practices that determine the meaning of our rights as Aboriginal peoples. Yet, counter to Dale's argument, and then Dale's a friend of mine and I respect him very much, I've learned lots from him, I would want to suggest, however, that over the last 40 years, and this is the core argument of my book, Indigenous peoples have become incredibly skilled at participating in the Canadian and legal and political practices that Turner suggests. In the wake of the 1969 White Paper, these practices emerged as the hegemonic approach to forging change in the political relationship with Canada. We have also seen, however, that our efforts to engage these discursive and institutional so-called nation-to-nation model built on a framework of mutuality and equality between peoples. Here, the 17th century Haudenosaunee-Two or Wampum Treaty with the Dutch often stands as the paradigmatic model of this normative relationship, depicting, of course, two vessels, a ship and a canoe, traveling down a river in parallel and with autonomy, with each boat never attempting to steer or control the destiny of the other. The problem with these nation-to-nation relationships, when applied to the power relations that we contemporarily face, is that it assumes a moral equivalency between the colonizer and the colonized that does not exist. It also assumes the legitimacy of the ship of state's economic, legal, and political institutions that have all but destroyed the river and now eroded the riverbanks. Under such conditions, recognizing in a mutual relationship the colonial ship of state's right of travel is an impossibility, and we need to start orienting our struggles in a decidedly different end. An end to the idea that we can have a nation-to-nation relationship with an inherently colonizing and corrosive social order and oriented towards, as I have come to understand it, a form of decolonization that seeks to capsize and sink that ship, put the ship at the bottom of the river. That's a joke.
How do we, development?
So, sink the ships and teach people how to build canoes, or what? What follows?
I actually don't, well, and this is probably a bit nerdy of an answer, I don't think that, like, in the form of critique that's, when it has become, like, very clear that the institutions of the dominant society, its economy, its political formations, is actually incapable of respect, recognition, and all of these things that our traditions, the Two-Road-Welcome Treaty has demanded. Then we have to start thinking differently about it, and we have to start. It needs to be challenged, both discursively but also in practice. And in practice, I think that will come through establishing alternative relationships, but it will also necessitate a confrontation with the ship state, to keep on the metaphor. And I know that you're not doing that, but also the demand that we have a readily articulated alternative doesn't provide any sort of moral illegitimacy to the critique itself. That's an empirical, like, this is an unsustainable society. The economy is predatory and it cannot respect the autonomy of others. It's an incorporative machine that is totalizing in nature as a structural imperative. So even though I don't have like, this is what the alternative would look like, that doesn't delegitimize a critique, and it doesn't delegitimize our efforts or our demands that we start thinking differently about it and thinking of alternative ways of relating to each other. So I don't know what that would look like, but I still think that I have a hunch that it's right, and we have to start thinking seriously about it, or else we're not going to get anywhere.
I was thinking that your argument is more towards metaphors of violence, and you mean that literally as well, versus ideas of alternatives or seduction or other kinds of practices.
Well, this is, Richard and I were talking about this over here, and I'm not being literal, but I'm not also being figurative. There will, like, and I say this in the direct action part, like, if like damage to the colonial relationship is actually going to be effective, then that's going to provoke conflict. And that conflict may or may not end in violence. That's usually determined by the state and not Indigenous people. So I adhere to kind of a notion of violence that's articulated by Paddy Alfred and Masada in particular, where I'm not a preacher of it, even though I'm a finance scholar, but I'm also not going to like morally harp on it when communities courageously stand up and defend their territories by violent encroachment by state and corporations that literally threaten their way of life, that they're genocidal intent or intent.
Yeah.
Really, I know you weren't here earlier today, but there was one of the McDonald's, Sir John McDonald statues was defaced. I think it was last year. Maybe before that. Yeah, the one in the park. And like people had written, I can't say what was exactly on it, but it was like all the stuff there obviously was not involved. And earlier today, the statue came up, and there were like some comments by people that were kind of along the lines of like, I don't condone graffiti or like destruction of property. And I found myself thinking like, why is this like a thing where we have to say like we don't I'm trying to ask is like, how do we have these conversations within our own communities without just being like, fuck the and fuck bank councils and like, you know, let's just leave out all the conservative and liberal Indigenous people in our community. Like, how do we have those conversations with each other without just being like, I hate you?
Actually, I don't do any of that in the book. I think that the negotiations that we made are often done by upright people, by people who want the best for their communities, by people that are placed in between a rock and hard place. These negotiations are to address the material consequences of them are like they're often in order to alleviate crushing material realities of poverty and all these sorts of things. I recognize that, but I also want to recognize and make the argument that perhaps it's not working, and perhaps that we might use our labor and our efforts and redirect it towards other projects that suck away from all of the time and energy that we've put into what is proving itself not only to not be working, but maybe kind of change our minds as to what we ought to be doing in the first place. What is right, what's wrong, what is it that we're out for? Is it health, happiness, reconnection to culture, community, land, all these sorts of things? Or is it about getting more jobs? Is it about gaining more resource rents? These sorts of things. There's been a shift that I've understood over time for many people of what we mean by the struggle being for land. In the 1960s and 70s, my community was for land. It was like, this struggle is for our relationship, like our kin in land. And now it's for land as a material resource that we can exploit for profit and monetary gain and so on. And I just think that that needs to be said, and it is being said. Like, there's nothing other than the kind of academic stuff and the theory stuff in here that I don't hear in conversations and engage in conversations in communities. So the conversations are already happening. And they kind of exploded onto the scene, I think, during that a little more. Especially because then it was split, like the diversity in our communities were split over January 11th. Should we seek recognition, or should we take this to the land and the streets? And we saw that diversity kind of fracture and whatnot. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that's a productive sort of conflict in our communities. The thing of property damage is that we just have to be like, well, something like property damage is frowned upon in that sort of way because it's viewed as violent. When Fanon at the beginning of Wretched of the Earth says decolonization will be always a violent phenomenon, he's saying it literally in his case in Algeria, but he's also saying it because it doesn't matter what you do as a colonized person, it will always be characterized as violent by the colonizer, especially if it's doing the right work that it should be. So take, for instance, the most peaceful act of civil disobedience and resistance that you could do, a hunger strike. That was characterized in the media as taking Canada hostage. Like all of this, like this very violent imagery of a woman who was trying to protect her treaty rights, and in doing so, sacrificing her body and her life in the most peaceful way. It's violent, so it doesn't like you could deface and cut like John A. like the statue off the head, whether or not that's actually violent or not, or it will be characterized as such. So we kind of also have to just recognize that whatever we do will be characterized, if it's effective, as disruptive, violent, militant, all this sort of stuff. Maybe instead of us being too concerned with it, we should start those dialogues in community, but also kind of be a bit like, well, at least we're doing something right here. It's pushing buttons. It's unacceptable. It's not within the pre-existing sort of colonial discourse of acceptability and civility.
Glen, you talked, in your talk, you referred a lot to the binary between Indigenous and state. But there's more to it than that, of course. John Ralston Salt liked to homogenize the whole thing and send it into the future that way. But what about those fellow human beings, 90% of the population in this geographic state that come from all over the world. Some of those want to decolonize themselves. What's our role in that?
How, like indigenous people's role?
Well, at least, I mean, there's a lot of Aboriginal people who are not indigenous anymore. So, it's a transitory process that most of us are involved in. Do we have a responsibility? Well, no, I feel we have a responsibility, but I want you, turn your curiosity to that question.
The core of why I do talk about it more in terms of our relationship with Canada or the state is because I do want to emphasize that it can be different with the humans that are here. I don't think it can be different when these things are churned through the state institutions and institutions of economic power and so on. But we can relate with non-Indigenous peoples in more equitable, respectful, peaceful ways. How we go about doing that or what our responsibilities are, I don't know. It depends on when you ask me. Sometimes I get so sick of the solidarity literature. And how do we go? What should we do? I get that all the time from students and people who are really, really committed to making changes in their lives with Indigenous peoples. Sometimes I just see that go as another form of kind of centering the settler self, and it's like, well, I'm not going to do anything until I'm told by an Indigenous person what to do. I think if I were honest, it would be more of a demonstration through practice, I guess through the enactment and creation of alternatives, and I guess an educational role in explaining why those alternatives grounded in Indigenous kind of ontological orders and practices are just simply a better option. But I do think that it is our responsibility to create these alternatives, and insofar as non-Indigenous peoples are willing to support those efforts, then we have a relationship that we can work with. That's why I also say that in order, capsize and sink the ship is not necessarily talking about non-Indigenous peoples. It's talking about the institutions that have been so bound up and kind of now embody the Canadian identity has to go. And those who are willing to decolonize and shed those corrosive attachments including in our own, and it might sound like I'm harping on non-native people, including my whole book is the way in which that's why it's Red Skin White Mass, is the way in which we are now contributing in that process. So those of us who are serious about decolonizing ourselves, whether native or non-native, that's what I mean by kind of destroying that ship. We have to destroy all of these psychoaffective attachments in the Fanonian language that are destroying us, that lock us in a position of what Fanon calls our inculcated inferiority and our assumptions about our own superiority.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'm going to use Bob Lovelace's category that he introduced recently at the decolonization conference, and I'm going to call myself hopefully somewhat enlightened member of the settler community. And I guess I have two talking points that I want to run by you. Perhaps, as you would say, two talking points that I would want to run by you. I guess I consider myself enlightened in terms of beliefs, and then in practice, my use of resources is fairly light. And I've been thinking a lot about the stuff in the media about mineral resource development. And what I wonder is, what I think to speak against it is to say that I'm concerned that it would exacerbate existing inequality in the Aboriginal community in a tremendous way. And then I also tend to have, my second talking point would be that I, as a settler type, view one of the things, the ways that Aboriginals contribute to Canada and the world is that they are the stewards of this land for all people present in Canada, but everywhere in the world, to make sure that it is used in a sustainable and supportive way. So those two talking points, exacerbating existing inequality and the role of Aboriginals as stewards of the land, are those useful things for somebody with my identity to talk to people about when the issues are raised?
Yep.
Are they harmful? Or
No, the only thing, this is nitpicky, but I just don't like the term Aboriginals, because what's important is Aboriginal peoples. Peoples are nations that have a right to self-determination. Aboriginals is a way of collapsing us into like a kind of a state-sanctioned sort of identity. So that's but you're right. I think that these sorts of economic activities are inherently based on increasing inequalities, both between Indigenous nations and the state, but also within Indigenous communities and within the non-Indigenous communities. It's called capitalism. That's how it works. And then yeah, no, I don't use the term stewardship. I haven't thought about why, but it's right. Yeah, like Indigenous peoples have, for millennia, had a much more sustainable relationship with nature based on kind of an ethics of place-based reciprocity and an obligation to land. And I think that when that's taken seriously, like it's not just words, it's actually deeds, then yeah, why wouldn't we want to talk about that and kind of convince people that maybe this version is not meeting the demands for a healthy, sustainable, long-term existence, and maybe we ought to kind of consider what Indigenous peoples have been saying all along and get on board with a different form of life, one that's not what my supervisor for my dissertation is now describing a difference between a vicious social system and a virtuous one.
who's that?
James Tully.
I was just thinking about the conversation around the tagline. When you talk about sinking the colonial ship, there's also sinking the capitalist ship, the ship of which is destroying much of the world at this point. And to my mind, I think that's the point of connection with non-native society, because anybody who really is looking at what's happening in the world knows that this absolutely unsustainable society, which is at war with everybody, the native peoples are the focal point. But the war is total, right? And insofar as it's the capitalist ship that is being sunk in addition to the colonialist ship, I see that as the point of connection with non-native society. I mean, people I know who would be happy to see it sink, non-native people. I think it doesn't talk to the decolonization process in that way, but I think that to my mind, that's one of those points of connection that I can see. I was also interested in the whole question of statues and symbolic violence, because I know that in New Mexico, a Pueblo revolt in the 1600s, when in response the right foot of most of the men in the society was cut off. And I can't remember who the statue was for. I guess the Spanish Inquisitors, they cut off his foot. Like, there's very symbolic ways of the destruction of statues, I think is part of that getting at the symbolic violence part.
There's a very telling property damage story from UBC when the Pocahontas, the rape chants and stuff like that were happening. Was it last year? And then there was a sexual predator on the loose on UBC campus that was assaulting women mostly at night. And so our business school was involved in this kind of rape culture through their chants and hazing activities. And somebody had painted "Stop Rape Culture" across the Soccer School of Business. And what came out as the violence was the violence of vandalism.
And the graffiti.
And we're talking about people like advocating the rape of Native women and a sexual predator on campus that UBC, the institution of UBC, has been absolutely negligent in actually dealing with. And what the controversy is a spray paint across the business school saying stop rape culture. That's the violent act. It's this absurd.
Yeah.
So would you say that a productive role for settlers is to work within our own society to break colonial mentality in order to develop our own no to a capitalist or predatory state?
Yeah, that project needs to happen. It needs and I'm all, it's kind of my job, I'm all for education, and I think that part of a long-term project will require rewiring of how a lot of people think, the unpacking of a shit ton of lies that have been told over time. Yeah, but I would also say, like, I don't know, Indigenous peoples need material support. They need people who are out there supporting these struggles, especially when they get a little bit more. Especially in those moments where Canadians will tend to like step away and be like, oh, that's too disruptive. Like, don't slow down my car trying to give me a leaf right when I'm trying to get to like Starbucks before work. Like, that's the problem with I Don't Know More, is that even though we have the most quote support that we've ever had in recent history, most of it was instrumental support around environmental issues. So you had a bunch of non-natives say like, yeah, no, the ends of their struggle insofar as they're about protecting the environment are the same as mine, so of course I'm going to support them, especially because they're doing a good job, a way better job than we have at actually making this a public issue. I'm in support of First Nations. That's not in support of First Nations sovereignty and land and freedom. That's just in support of people who are making headways because you share their goals in that instance. When those goals go away, then you see people back off. Oh, their goals is about reclamation of what we claim as our park. No, I can't support that. So we need to have more substantive forms of solidarity that are geared around respect for Indigenous law, Indigenous people's freedom, their lands, and their relationships to land. Not just instrumental support because like a Canadian might happen to share an interest in the same ends or goals.
I'm wondering what you think about universities as a system of producing people, well, credentialing, and our role within it.
I love universities. There's been a lot of talk within Indigenous circles about kind of using the language of indigenization, like indigenizing the university, and trying to unpack its kind of break its relationship historically, like Western educational institutions with colonialism. And I think that that's probably like a valiant effort, and I think that work is important. I tend to think I like to think more broadly about my role as an educator, and I don't necessarily, and I think that actually some of like my paid work I do is best within the constraints of the university that I have, which challenge it that way. But I also think that education has to take part outside of those institutions as well. You have to be in community, whether it's the work, like the educational work that I do in the downtown east side, or working with these sorts of projects, or it's the land-based education that I do with a program called Inchinta, where it's like reconnecting Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to those kind of ethical practices and relationships with land that kind of inform our critical frameworks and our self-understandings. So I think I would say for a short answer is like, yeah, like universities are important sets of struggle, but they can't be the only ones.
so difficult to live in a society, settler society, one being a settler, and to try to talk to people, Glen, with regards to putting bodies on the line, particularly white settlers, it becomes undigestible. When I look at a situation like Egypt, where I come from, where I've been involved, etc., and looking at 13, 14, 15-year-olds that are dying out in the streets, all that there is the direct action, the reactionary confrontation with that power, right? Snipers on rooftops over there, they start with snipers, and then after that, water cannons and everything else. Right? And when they shoot at the eyes to blind you. There aren't the creation of alternatives over there. Highly problematic. There isn't the creation of knowledge. Completely decimated. Throughout the Middle East, generally. Corruption rampant, yada, yada, yada. Let alone to talk to people over there with regards to decolonization. What do you mean decolonization? We're post-colonial nations. Yeah, but right, you have to call yourself post-colonial nations when you never engage in the project of decolonization. You simply accepted the capitalist nation states that were transplanted, for God's sake, the debauchery laws, the honor-killing laws, etc. Though they're still from the French Napoleonic codes. So it doesn't factor in this element of education. But yeah, they're ready for confrontation. They're ready all the time. They look for it all the time. There's this palpable rage, explosive rage that's going on all throughout the region. The opposite over here. The education exists, the resources ostensibly, and the know-how with regards to establishing creative alternative communities. But for, again, particularly settlers, of which I'm one, for people to put their bodies on the line, everything that they have, with the recognition of, yes, we need to transcend this colonized or colonized binary. Yes, as you mentioned exactly, Fanon, decolonization is inherently violent act, the rupturing of myself and the other. What will come afterwards, well, as the Zapatista has taught, we hold each other's hands, and we're going to discover that later. I guess my question is, it arises more out of a point of frustration. Like, how does one, especially when, again, it comes to, because I share your views exactly with regards to violence, like,
for confrontation to kind of push buttons that are obviously effective because they produce such a response. But you're pushing buttons already is some kind of a response. Like you have like a familiar language, you can no longer breathe, so you gotta confront it. It's a matter of land and life sort of thing. And then there's the question of like kind of more overt sort of violence. So in my own work, I think that's why I think that the Black Skin White Mask is such a rich text, because it's written in with kind of the notion of struggle. This will take struggle. This will take confrontation. This will be painful. It's not easy to come to recognize your own complicity in these processes, whether you're the colonized native or the settler colonist. So I just would want to make a distinction between kind of confrontation and struggle from what we tend to think of it as kind of like more overt acts of violence. But they bleed into each other as well. And we also have to recognize that. We have to also recognize, like in their more overt forms, that will get squashed, like especially indigenous peoples, because that's when the allies start backing away and you're kind of on your own now. And the guillotine and the hammers come out, and the guns come out. But like, who would argue against like a principle like defense of oneself, and when oneself is so bound up with your place in the world, your land, then that we ought to defend. That's what's gonna salvage this. That's what everybody depends on. That's it's not just Indigenous peoples, defending that relationship in place and that kind of notion of self in place is what everyone needs to recognize that needs to be done. And when you do it in a way that's effective, that is actually that is disrupting dominant power relationships, then we have to be prepared that will not be looked at and taken lightly. And we need to better support people. Instead of becoming an Aboriginal rights litigant, as a non-native or native scholar, become a criminal law lawyer, get people out of jail when they're out there defending their territory against fracking. We don't need any more Aboriginal rights lawyers. We need criminal law lawyers, people who will defend us and our communities when they say, no, you're not coming in here and doing that to this territory and to our community.
Yeah. Economically, you mentioned return to more traditional practices and maybe providing for yourself. How do you think that type of approach would affect your ability to interact with the state that isn't going away and to advance the rights that you said you were hoping to do for the state?
Well, I look at it and like there's a whole chapter on the Dene were quite proficient in making like trying to negotiate that. They had it like really nicely mapped out on paper what this would look like in kind of political economic terms. But the irony is that previous to that being taken off the land and sitting at these negotiation tables, and then eventually into the high constitutional talks about recognition of Aboriginal rights. The irony of what is it took people out of the practices that they were actually trying to argue that should be implemented. And that was like our experience with capitalism, for example, and I mapped this out quite a bit in the chapter. Didn't become a kind of corrosive, as like such an asymmetrical relationship until the post-war. Up until that point, it was only in the 1950s and 60s that the state, through a process that's remarkably close to what Marx referred to as primitive accumulation, started to forcefully settle our communities. There's a massive price and increase in the cost of trade goods and a drop in the world price of furs, which meant that we now had to engage in order to live our life on the land in a traditional economy. We now had to supplement that with seasonal paid labor, and Canada came in at that moment and just exploited that political economic sort of destabilization. So I think that what it would look like and this is where there's the know-how and reestablishing that know-how is to concern ourselves with doing it. So you have the Unistoten camp on Wet'suwet'en territory that is a blockade from the outside perspective that is going to try and stop pipelines from destroying their land and way of life. But it's also they're engaging in these practices of sustainable political economic decision making and harvesting practices. So it's not being negotiated or asked for, it's being done. The interesting thing about the Dene though is that they were trying to think about what would participating economically in a contemporary society look like if it wasn't based on traditional practices, but it was thought through and organized in accordance to traditional values. And that's where I think it was interesting because it became, well, we could organize a workplace in a way that was still Dene, even though we're not doing what is typically Dene stuff. And that is like, well, let's toy with these notions of cooperatives and what from a non-native perspective might be like workplace democracy or even participatory economics, because they were saying like this is a way in which we can do a diversity of things economically that we would use to sustain ourselves, but still be at its core values based on being Dene.
sort of just a quick follow-up, because it seems that if you remove yourself from the system that is so pervasive here, that you would have a tougher time, I'm not sure how to say this, tougher time realizing the rights that you're talking about wanting to realize. And you could have them for yourself, but they wouldn't be recognized in the same way in all Canada. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I'm not sure.
Or maybe forget.
Simple question, is the book available?
There's 3 here, so you have to fight for it.
One's for board directions.
I have one.
Okay.
So there's 3 plus 4.
So people start reselling their copies.
On eBay.
Well, I just wanted to say on behalf of our directors, now go out to Glen for your words and for everybody coming out. And I just want to close and say safe travels on your next journey.